Cordia, August of Road. Welcome to be my guest with me, Mary Honan, on Lear Media TV, supporting the Samaritans, Limerick and Tipperary, Clare's Wish Foundation in Limerick, and Deal Animal Rescue in West Limerick. Now, my guest today, and I'm utterly privileged, is Eva Geiringer Schloss MBE, who was born in Austria on the 11th of May 1929. She is a Holocaust survivor whose father and brother Heinz sadly perished in the camps, and she is the stepdaughter of Otto Frank, the father of Margot and Anne Frank. She is one of the founders of the Anne Frank Trust UK, along with Gillian Wands Perry, MBE, who I also recently interviewed. Eva is here today, however, to tell her story and to keep the memory alive of both Anne and her beloved brother Heinz and his wonderful artwork that survived the camps. Welcome, Eva Geiringer Schloss, MBE. Hello, Eva. How are you? I know that your story and your connection to Anne is probably something that you've almost become so used to, but you on your own are a survivor of the Holocaust as well, and so were your family. And I'm interested in finding out Eva Schloss's story, Eva Geiringer Schloss's story, before we talk about Anne. Could you tell me a little bit about your life and your experiences during World War II and how you met Anne first?
Correct, yes. Well, I was Austrian, born in Vienna, and I had a very big extended family with grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins. My mother had a sister and my father had a sister with children. And Austria is a very beautiful country with lakes and mountains. And I was very much into sport. Even as a little girl, I already was always walking barefoot in the mountains. I loved swimming. When I was 2 years old, my father threw me in the water and I couldn't swim. And he went after me and saved me. But, I was a daredevil. My brother, on the other hand, he was the older brother, was quite different. He was a bookworm. And and we shared a room because I was scared to sleep by myself because I heard neighbors saying it had been broken in, and then I expected burglars to come always. So we shared our room, and at night my brother told me all the stories he read, adventure stories and Jules Verne, and read Indian stories, which was very, very popular at the time. And so I thought, well, why should I learn to read? I wasn't interested. And in the weekend, we did excursions in the mountains. My father was one of the first people who had a car. And weekend, usually we spent with the grandparents to sleep there in the evening. And my grandfather was very musical. He really wanted to become a pianist, but he refused to learn to read music. He said, if you sing something or if I hear something, I can play it. So he was not accepted. But he took my brother on his lap and he showed him already how to play on the piano. And my brother really took to this. He obviously had his talent.
You were very close to your brother.
I mean, I was not interested in books or in learning. I just wanted to play and sport and things like that. And he was very, very intellectual and musical. And later, in hiding, he started to paint. We'll talk about this a bit later.
Yeah.
And but life changed completely one morning when the Nazis in 1938, when the Nazis just marched in. There was no agreement with our Austrian government. They just took it over. And The Austrians, so they always said they want to be independent, started to be in the streets shouting Heil Hitler, and all suddenly they had swastika flags. We were shocked about it. Even our neighbors who were before very much against it joined in this. Yeah, it was unbelievable. And immediately, this is a tragedy, that people changed their attitude and became violently aggressive and anti-Semitic. I was at the time 7 years old, and my best friend was Catholic. And on the way home, I always went to her house to play a bit. But after Hitler marched in, the mother stood in the door when she saw me, and she said, "We never want to see you here again." And she slammed the door in my face. I went home crying. I said to my mother, "I don't understand. We didn't have a quarrel." And my mother said, "Well, for Jewish people, life is going to be very, very difficult." My brother too, he came home from school and he looked terrible. His face was all covered in blood, his clothes were torn. And when my parents asked him, "Heinz, what have you done? What happened to you?" And he started to cry. He said, "My own friends did that, and the teachers just watched it happening." So you can imagine my father, who must have, I mean, they didn't tell anything about politics to us, but obviously he had suspected something like this might happen, because in 1938, Germany was already starting to, Jewish people had lost their jobs, and there were even camps like Dachau. People were interned there already. And so he said, well, perhaps that might happen in Austria. So he obviously had made plans. Yeah. He owned a shoe factory, which he had inherited from his father, and he had business connection with the Netherlands, with Holland. And the south of Holland had a big shoe industry, and he obviously had done business with them. So he said, as long as it's still, there was chaos, of course, in the beginning. I'm going to escape to Holland and try to get for you a permit to follow us.
Why Holland, Eva? Why Holland? Had you family in Holland that you decided to move to?
Well, because he had obviously connections there.
Yeah.
I think later, when I was an adult, my mother told me he sold shoes to Holland, and let's say it was 3,000 guilders, which I had to pay. He had just 1,000 come back to Austria, and he kept the 2,000 in Holland. So already very looking into the future. And but by the time we wanted to follow, the Nazis had closed the borders, and not only we couldn't get out, but we couldn't get in anywhere. In 1936, already that early, President Roosevelt had a conference in Evian in France, where all the leaders were invited, European leaders, and they were discussing, if necessary, how many Jewish people would each country take in.
And nobody accepted any Jewish children at the Evian conference, including, it has to be said, the country I've been brought up in, Ireland. We were one of the countries to actually refuse point blank to take in any Jewish children, men, woman, and child, but specifically they were being asked to take children. But they took known Nazis in and hid known Nazis. People didn't seem to have the problem.
As spies, probably, huh? Yeah.
Very well known Nazis. Very well known Nazis.
I know. Anyway, so we couldn't go, and we were, of course, on writing letters. Telephone was not international. Telephone was not, you forget that now you can get anywhere. You can get in touch with everybody with internet, but that was all not possible. So eventually we heard that we could go to Belgium. So better than staying in Austria, we did. So that was in 39. So we settled in Brussels, but of course we were not able to take anything with us, just a little suitcase with a little bit of a few clothes, that's all. Everything we had to leave behind. And of course I couldn't speak French. I had to go to the local school. I had no idea what was going on. I became very, very withdrawn, very frightened. I had to do a dictation. I had no idea what to write. So the teacher, the refugees was not something which existed very much. So people didn't know why am I here? What am I doing here? I don't even speak the language. So I wrote this dictation. Every word was, of course, wrong. And the teacher showed it to the class how stupid I am. Can you imagine? So of course I lost all my confidence and it was really awful. But people learn. I started to learn my French. My mother was very good in French. She had French. She was even a French instructor. So she married when she was 18. She never really used it. But she taught me and I started to speak better. And it was my birthday. And I asked if I could invite a few little girls. In Vienna, we always had beautiful birthday parties. And she said, yes, you can invite 5, 6 little girls. And I gave them all a letter with my address. And on the day of my birthday, they all brought letters from their parents that they are not allowed to come to my party. I went home crying. And my mother said, well, we are Jewish refugees. People just don't want to mix with us. So Belgium was not a good memory for me. But in the meantime, of course, the Second World War started. February 1940 was already a war through Poland and so on. And my father tried all the time to get permit for us to come to Holland. Eventually, in February 1940, during the war, we got a visiting permit for 3 months to come to Amsterdam. So we had, of course, no furniture, nothing. So my father rented a furnished apartment in a new area of Holland, of Amsterdam, Merwedeplein. The name is actually very familiar because that's where the Frank family lived as well. So it was a triangle.
So you lived in the same apartment block as Anne Frank when you moved to Holland, and there was only about a month or two in your ages. You were very close.
The Frank family came to Holland in 1933. Otto later told me always when he saw the Nazis going through the street with singing a very Nazi song, when Jewish blood drips from our knives, then things are going to get better. So when Otto saw this, he said, this is not a country where I want to bring up my children. And he left for Holland, and that was still possible in 1933. And settled down on the Merwedeplein. So that was a modern kind of development with apartments built in sort of a triangle. And on the one end was a skyscraper, the only skyscraper, 11 floors at the time in Holland. And so if you say you lived on the Merwedeplein near the skyscraper, everybody knew where that was. And so we lived opposite on this triangle, but it was quite small apartment, and no gardens, of course, for children to play. We lived on the first floor. There were 3 floors. And so all the children came out to play after school. Schools finished at 3 o'clock, and so there was plenty of time to play. And so one day, and I went out as well, trying to find friends again. And a little girl came to me, introduced herself. She said, "I'm Anne Frank. Where do you come from?" I said, actually from Austria. So she said, "Oh, you speak German?" I said, "Yes." So she took me to her apartment where I met her father, Otto, because she couldn't speak German, just that understood it, but couldn't speak it because she was only 4 when they left.
You describe Anne as being much more mature than you and much more into academics and into studying like your brother, but you were much more into the sports.
Yeah.
And was she always precocious, and was she always somebody that was interested in getting her point across?
Yeah, that's right. So Anna had an older sister, and when I told her I had a brother, she said, "Oh, you are so lucky out there for a sister. When can I come and meet him?" She was already with 11 and 12 years, quite a flirt. Well, in the book she writes about she had many boyfriends. I must say I was not interested in boys yet. You know, boys came to the house all the time. It was nothing special. But so we became friends, but she went to the local Montessori school and I went to the ordinary local school. Later on, I asked Otto, why did Anne go to this school and not Margot? He said, well, she was a bit difficult, a bit different. She needed more special attention. Her nickname was Mrs. Quack Quack because she always talked so much in school, and she also had to stay behind and write 10 lines, 100 lines of I'm not going to talk so much in class anymore. But she just did. And as well on the Merwede plan, she assembled a group of children and always told them stories and so on. She was already a good storyteller at the time. So, and we settled down. We were very happy to be together in this furnished apartment. There was a piano, so Heinz could play already by that time. So he was very happy. And yeah, life was good, but only very, very short. Because in May, the Nazis invaded already Holland. And
Yeah.
it was a very short war, just 5 days. That was the first time that a civilian city had been bombed, Rotterdam, with 10,000 casualties. And of course, the Dutch had to give up. So we still tried to escape to England, but it was too late. So we thought, well, we'll see what happens. And nothing happened. Life just went on like ordinarily. But the
And
Germans had.
Eva, at that time, was there any possibility at that time of you getting on the Kinder transport with Sir Nicholas Winton, and the Quakers had set up the Kinder transport to bring children out of war-torn Europe into
we I don't know. From Holland, we never heard anything. You know, if we would have been there perhaps long, we might have had more contacts and perhaps we would have heard, but we didn't know. The sad thing is, Otto had relatives in London, and his cousin had asked him, why don't you send us the children as long as the situation is bad in Europe, and we will look after them. And, you know, nobody thought the war will last such long. But Otto and his wife were debating about it, and Otto wrote back, life without our children would be completely meaningless. Thank you very much. Very often later he said, if only I hadn't been so selfish, and the children would have been safe. You know, but nobody imagined how horrible it was going to be.
Nobody could imagine
The Dutch said, don't worry, we are going to protect you. But of course, they had no chance to do that. They had a very, very bad Nazi as running the country, says Inquart, an Austrian actually. And slowly the measures came against the Jewish people. And at first it was inconvenient, but later, of course, it became life-threatening. So for 2 years, we lived sort of in fear, and people disappeared. We had to wear the yellow star. We were not allowed to go on public transport. We had to hand in our bicycles. We were only allowed to go shopping in Jewish shops. Life became really not pleasant anymore. We had to be in. We were not allowed to mix with non-Jewish people. It was very, very unpleasant. We had to leave our schools and go to Jewish schools. Well, you might say that's okay. We have Jewish schools in England everywhere. But the Nazis came with trucks, went into classrooms, said to the children, go on the truck. The parents waited in the evening for the children to come home. Didn't come. So they went to the police, even the Nazi police. Nobody gave them any information. Only after the war did we hear they were sent to Mauthausen, which was a horrific Austrian death camp with cliffs, and they were just thrown down from the cliffs. But we didn't know that. But the fact was that many, many Jewish children had disappeared. So in 1942, 10,000 young people, including Anne's older sister Margot and Heinz, my brother, and many, many others, a call-up notice to, within a week, to go to a certain place, to be deported to Germany, to work in German factories. Well, by that time, in 1942, most German Jews had been already deported, mainly in ghettos in Poland or even in the different camps. So why should they ask more Jewish people to come to Austria, to Germany? So my father and many, many other, mainly refugees, the Dutch Jews thought, well, yeah, they are strong, they can work. But the refugees especially said, no way will we send our children. And my father called us together and said, we are going to go into hiding. I found 2 wonderful families who are going to take us so that we would be safe. But I couldn't find a family who would take in 4 people. So we have to split up. Heinz will go with him and I will go with Mutti, my mom. And I started to cry. I was 13 years old. I didn't want to be separated. And my father said, look, it's only till Christmas the war will be. America was already in the war, probably just a few months. And he said, if we are in 2 different places, the chance that 2 of us will survive is bigger. Survive. So that was the first time that I really became scared and realized I might be killed. So that was, of course, terrible. So this is what happened. We split up. We went to one hiding place and Heinz and my father to a different place. And we were hiding for 2 years, means different places, because the Nazis knew that not everybody had turned up. Quite a few people had gone into hiding. So, and they really wanted to get everybody. So where are they? So they did house searches. At night, when you slept, there was ringing the bell, people had to open. Christian, anybody had to let the Nazis in and search their homes. So you can imagine the people didn't dare to go to sleep. And we had in every hiding place where we were, the people from the resistance. There were big resistance movement who hated to be occupied by the Nazis and hated them. Did all kind of wonderful jobs. One thing was they looked at the hiding place and made hiding places somewhere. So sometimes under the floorboard, sometimes in a cupboard, sometimes even they made a wall with a trapdoor. So this is what happened. At night, we always quickly had to go and hide. And of course, the people who hid us, they became nervous. They said, we can't sleep anymore. You have to look for a different place. So we moved around perhaps 6 or 7 times.
Yeah.
And Heinz and my father as well, same thing. In 1944, my father, they were in the country at the time, in a little village. My father phoned my mother and said, the woman where they are hiding is blackmailing them for more money. Because we had to pay, of course, not outrageous, but this woman asked more money. And so after my father couldn't go to work anymore, so he had some saving, but it was running out. So he said, we can't stay there. If the war still lasts, they'll throw us out anyway. So please, we were in Amsterdam. Can you get in touch with the resistance and try to find us a new hiding place? Which my mother did. And so she phoned my father and said, yes, there and there, and you have to go there and so on. So they went to this new hiding place. And I was very, very miserable not seeing my brother and father. So we looked very Dutch, blonde and blue-eyed. Now I'm white, but I used to be blonde. And what I was just saying, yeah. So my parents decided it was very near where we were staying at the time, that we would go and visit them. So we did that, and on the Sunday when they moved there, and they were very happy, it was a nice place and so on. And on Tuesday was my 15th birthday, and we sat down to breakfast, and there was a knock on the door. Daytime was always safe. They didn't do that in daytime. And the owner opened the door, and 2 Nazis and 2 Dutch policemen stormed up the stairs and went straight for my mother and me.
Oh, geez.
So not a very nice birthday, as you can remember.
Betrayed by a double agent, weren't you? You were betrayed by a double agent.
The nurse who found my father this nice place turned out to be a double agent. But at the time when we were arrested, we had no idea how they have found us. Only when we were interrogated, they threatened me they would kill my brother. So I realized that they are caught as well. And then later, when I was together with my father and brother being transported, he told me the nurse, who was the owner of this apartment, opened the door to the Nazis and let them in. They had a long talk, and then they took him away. And they had followed us when we had visited, so they knew where we were. So very crafty on top of everything else.
But Eva, it must have been absolutely terrifying for you and Heinz, even though you were together in the transport, not knowing what was happening.
Yeah, of course it was. They never spoke to you. They never told us where we were going, what was happening, nothing. We spent the first night in a prison. The next night we were taken to a holding camp in Holland. And this is something quite funny. I said on Tuesday was my birthday, we were betrayed. On Wednesday we were in the prison. And in the evening we were taken to the holding camp. And on Friday we were put already on transport, serious transport to the east. And I spoke recently and at this holding camp in Holland. And I told this story, and the director said, "No, that's wrong. You were a whole 10 days in this holding camp." And I said, "No, I only two nights." He said, "No, look, I've got the records." Um, and obviously, I must have been in such a shock, thinking that that might be the end of my life, that I forgot completely what happened in this whole 10 days I was in this holding camp. This is something
And it has to be said,
because I remember everything very, very clearly, but this no recollection whatsoever of being 10 days in this holding camp. Peculiar, huh?
and
But
when
it
you
shows
say,
you.
and when you say they send you east, for anyone who doesn't know, east is to Auschwitz-Birkenau.
Well, we didn't know where we were going.
No. But
They
that is,
never told you. They never told you anything. But anyway, we were in the train to this holding camp was still an ordinary train. But now we were taken in this boxcar. I said, it looks like a container, really. No windows, of course, just a tiny, tiny slit with a barbed wire across and iron doors, everything locked, nothing, no light, nothing in it, just the floorboards. And 80 people were pushed into this. They put two buckets in, one for water to drink, the other one for toilets, for 8 people, open toilets, just a bucket. You can imagine. So it was dark, it was May, it was very hot because it was metal. People cried. It was a horrible, horrible, horrible journey. But the only nice thing was that we were together still as a family. That was really our last time that we were together. I didn't think that will happen, but I know that was a bit of a comfort. And my brother, he told me that while in hiding, he painted. And because he couldn't music, he started something else, and he created some amazing artwork. And he told me before they escaped from that woman who blackmailed them, he hid them under the floorboard of that house with a notice, "This belonged to Heinz and Eric Geiringer, and after the war, I'll come and pick it up again." And he told me, "Evie, so you know where the paintings are. If I don't come back and you do, please pick up the painting because they are really very important to me." And I said, "Of course you will come back. Of course you will both come back." And he kept on repeating, "If I don't come back, please promise me that you pick up the painting."
How old was Heinz at this stage?
16.
God love him.
So, yeah, so that is, I remember this really very, very clearly.
I'm reluctant to ask you this, but feel free not to answer if you don't want to. But what was it like at that moment when you said goodbye to Heinz and to your dad?
Well, then the train stopped eventually, and raus, the Nazis were there with dogs and many people in sort of striped outfits. And so we jumped out and we realized we were in Auschwitz. And that was, of course, even more scary because we knew that in Auschwitz, the Nazis were killing Jewish people by gassing them. So you can imagine. And you had to say goodbye because that is a huge, huge complex. I would say as big as London, with many different camps. Auschwitz was the main men camp, and Birkenau was a women camp, but there were other camps, Monoway and different camps, where there were factories and all kinds of things. A huge, huge, huge area. We were in Birkenau, but the men had to walk to Auschwitz, which was about 3 miles. Later I knew that. At the time I had no idea. But you can imagine the goodbye you said to each other. assuming perhaps you will never ever see each other. And then, so the men walked off, and then we had to stand in rows of 5. I was still in the clothes, a dress I was arrested in, but somebody in this holding camp had given my mother a hat and coat, and my mother says, "Put this on, take it." And I didn't want to. It was hot, and it was, a big coat and a big hat. But my mother, yes, said, perhaps it comes in handy later. So I put it on. And then Dr. Mengele, you probably have heard, he was a camp doctor, but he didn't look after the well-being of people. Only he decided who was going to die and who was going to live. So the first selection was taking place. We had to stand in rows of 5 this way, and then all the people this way. And he came, looked you over, fraction of a second, and he decided right or left. So, and it was a very sunny day, and the sun shone, and I had this big hat with a rim, and he didn't see how young I was. So I passed his first selection. My mother, till her dying days, always said to me, remember when I saved your life, when I gave you my hat and coat. And that is true, because there were older girls who were taken to the wrong side.
Yeah.
So I was actually the youngest of this whole Dutch lot of people who were deported.
It all came down to that phrase, which I hear so often, even today, essential worker and non-essential worker, which makes me cringe today when you hear people using that phrase in relation to COVID and getting back to work. And it was used so prevalently during the Holocaust, where people, if they were too young or too old, they became non-essential because they couldn't work. And you were just lucky with the coat and the hat that they didn't know that you were too young to work. That's exactly how you survived, because they thought they could make use of you.
Yeah. Well, everybody who survived was a miracle. Anyway, so we entered the camp eventually, having lost about half our female transport. About the men, we had no idea what happened. And we were herded in a huge barrack, and the next command was undress completely naked. And all our clothes, everything, hat and coat, all was taken away. And we stood there naked. And then we had to register at the table. We had to say where we came from, what profession we had, what nationality, all kind of questions. Everything was put in books. They kept record of everything. Of course, I didn't say I was only 15. I said I was 17. And then all our hair was shaved. And then we got a tattoo number on our arm. And they said, forget you're a human being. You're like a cattle marked with a number. And if we ever want you, we call you out by your number, not by your name.
Have you ever forgotten your number, Eva?
Yeah, I've still got it, A5272.
A52.
Yeah, so and that took hours and hours, and it was very hot, and we were really shaking from cold, but we were so hot, because we were so scared. So eventually all this was done, and we were chased out naked, and we were 2 heaps, an enormous heap of clothes, and this was one garment, no underwear, just what could have been a winter coat or a summer dress. That's it. And the other heap was shoes. And you got from this heap 2 shoes. Could have been 2 right ones, a boot and a sandal, whatever. And then again, we were herded, quick. We always had to run in our barracks. You might have seen pictures of that. A long, long space with on both sides bunks, 3 high, wood, about 2 yards wide. Nothing was in it, just a plain wood, no straw, no pillow, nothing. And 8 people had to sleep in there. We had nowhere where we could keep anything, where we had nothing anyway. But later we wanted to have a mug or so, but you had nowhere to store anything or anything. So, and then we were in the morning early, we were called out and there was a roll call. We had to stand for 2 hours till the whole camp was counted, and we got then a little mug of some liquid. That was our breakfast. Then we were taken to work the whole day without washing, without toilet facilities, nothing. Just work, 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 work. Then in the evening, dead tired, again in front of the barrack, you had to stand for 2 hours. You're not allowed to move. They were checking. If you moved, you were beaten. And then we got our supper, which was usually a big chunk of bread. That was all. That was all the food we got.
To hear all these stories about life in the camp in Auschwitz and how the Greek Jews were the first to die because they didn't speak Yiddish and they didn't speak German, so they didn't understand the rules, and about people trading items just for bread or hiding bread in their pockets because they didn't think that
Well, we didn't always have pockets, you know. The bread, if somebody wanted to, because in the morning we didn't get any food, so we wanted to keep the bread to have something in daytime, but you couldn't put it anywhere. So you slept with the bread under your head. But not in the beginning, but later on, the person who slept next to you ate it away where you slept. People were so hungry, you know.
But
So,
do you ever wonder, you must wonder what happened to certain human beings that they could abdicate all humanity, and that a government could sanction what was done to you and your family?
but it was known, you know. This is a terrible thing. It was known. Churchill was very often asked after the war, why didn't you bomb the railway lines going to Auschwitz?
Yeah.
And he said, that didn't belong to the war effort. You know, it's horrible to say, but I think people really didn't care about Jewish people being murdered. You know, this is really what is behind it. They said, oh, well, we get rid of some millions of, nobody realized it was going to be millions, but it turned out to be 6 million of.
There's a wonderful priest in Catholic priest in France, and I'm hoping to interview him. Well, I am interviewing him in June, Father Patrick Desbois, and he has written and documented what he calls the Holocaust by bullets in Czechoslovakia,
Yeah.
and he has been on a search and on a mission to find all the bodies of people who were buried in mass graves, who were shot with single bullets between mothers and children, and these were ever before even the gas chambers, and there were thousands and thousands and thousands of graves being uncovered in Czechoslovakia. So the figures of 6 million is really conservative. I mean, by the time everybody is counted, the Holocaust by bullets and all the other atrocities towards the Jewish people and towards the 5 million non-Jews that died, it could be double 6 million. It could be treble 6 million. That's a really conservative number based on those that were killed.
Yeah.
And Auschwitz.
Yeah, well, and there were many, many camps, and the Nazis killed before the camps in Poland. They just shot people. They had to dig their own grave, stand in
Yep.
front of it, and then they shot, and that was it. Yeah, the Polish, Russian people, that, yeah, terrible. But they killed as well many, many, many Russians because they were nearly near Moscow. All this occupied country was devastated, it was ruined completely. Well, I come to that later because I traveled through all this later. Um, Anyway, so life became really very, very, very difficult. Many, many people died from our Dutch people, but as well, we worked hard every day, and so washing, forget about washing.
Yeah.
So we were filthy, we were full of lice. The only good thing was that once a week we went to a shower and we were deloused. So, and then our clothes, this one garment got deloused as well, and we got another garment. So that was all. Otherwise, it was never washing, never toilets. At night you could go, but it was quite far, and in the dark you had to go, and there was a bucket in the barrack where people could go, and at night when it was full you had to take it to the latrines. There was only one block where toilets were just holes in a cement thing, so filthy, of course, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
So people got typhus, dysentery, all kind of terrible illness, and died. Very often you woke up and the person next to you had
Is dead.
died at night. Yeah. Yeah, and then, I mean, there were a few miracles happened. Um, have you got enough time?
I can split the program in two and talk away, Eva.
Yeah, my mother, like any mother, very often gave me a bit of her bread, and she was a very tall woman, so she really became very, very thin. And so one day when we had a shower, um, we came out of the shower naked and just stood Mengele with some of his SS people, and the selection was taking place. So we had to turn around naked in front of him, and he sent this side or this side. Well, I passed, I went to the good side, and my mother followed me, and he let her turn around another time, and then he sent her to the wrong side. So about 40 of our Dutch transport at the time were selected to be killed. So I still rushed to my mother to say goodbye, but even that I wasn't allowed to do. And so those 40 naked women walked out, and I thought that's the last I've seen of my mother. You can imagine how that felt. It might have been perhaps October, could have been October, perhaps September, October. So I was on the point of giving it up. I said, I can't really carry on anymore. And I go out, and a couple, our guards said, somebody wants you outside. I said, oh my God, that's the end now of me. And I go outside, and there stood my father with an SS man. An unbelievable miracle that has never ever happened, that any man can come, and that he knew where I was. And I still, till now, I don't know how this was possible. And of course, I asked, how is Heinz? He said he's doing all right. He's okay still. And he was okay. And then he asked me, and where is
Mutti.
Muti, my wife? And I burst into tears, and I said she had been selected. So my poor father, I could see he just, but he tried to be strong for me. So he held me and he said, um, well, I'm sure Mutti is going to protect us. We'll make it. We'll be still a family, and so. But it was awful. But still, um, he went to the kitchen. He was an unbelievable, charming man. And he said his daughter is here. If she comes, could you give her a bit of extra food? And so really he did that, and he told me, you go to the kitchen and you ask for, I don't know the name, to this girl, and she will give you extra food. And I could do this for a few days. I really did that. So, this was a miracle. But so I really had strength, I say, and he said, soon it's finished, the Russians are already very near. So hold on, and Hans and you and me will be still a bit together. And then the Russians were really approaching, and the Nazis, lots of them left because they didn't want to fall into the hand of the Russians. And so sometimes there was A, B, C camps, all with electrified barbed wire with gates. And sometimes, because many of the guards had left, sometimes different gates were open. You couldn't escape, but you could go around to different parts. And I walked around once. There was no work that day. And I see some Dutch people coming from our transport who had been in a different part. And they saw me and they said, Eva, good that we see you because we have seen your mother. I said, what? She said, yes, she's safe, she's there and there. And I said, well, you want to support me, you want to just make me feel better. It's not true. She said, really, I promise you it's true. And it really was true. And one day then, after a while, I was able to go to this part of the block. And she was there. That is a long story how she was saved, but she was saved. So really,
and then
it was I can only call it as a miracle.
After the war, your dad and Heinz died. They didn't die in the camps. They died
they were taken out with the death march, as it was called. Because when the Russian came, as I say, a lot of Nazis left, but they took every day in the women's camp as well. Every day they took hundreds of people, thousands of people on transport. He said, when we leave here, Birkenau, we are going to burn the whole camp down. So nobody really wanted to stay behind. But my mother was so weak. She said, I can't walk, I can't go, I'd rather die here than going out in the snow and walk. So we stayed behind, mainly with ill people who couldn't really walk, about 500. So when the Russians came, there was only about 500 women in the women's camp. And we were saved through this. And that was 27th of January, the liberation of Auschwitz. I went then, but the Russians were fighting, so they liberated the camps. There were no Nazis around, but they couldn't look after us yet. They were pursuing the Nazis. And so I decided I would go to Auschwitz to try to find my father and brother. And I did that. And I looked around everywhere, and there were as well 500-600 men left there. And I came across a man who looked slightly familiar, but he looked very ashen and very thin and very poor condition. But I went to him and said, I think I've known you. You look familiar. And he said, yes, I'm Otto Frank, Anne's father. And I said, yes. But have you seen my father and Heinz? He said, no, I never saw them. But I know most of the people went with the Nazis when they took people away. So at that time, I had really hope. And he asked, of course, have you seen my girls and my wife? And I hadn't seen them. So I had great hope that they would be all right still. But of course, January and May, there was a long time still to go, wasn't it? So they were marched to Mauthausen and then later to another camp called Ebensee. But I didn't know anything of that, of course, at the time. And then the Russians realized they can't just leave us there. And so they decided they would take us eastward, deep into Russia to keep us safe. And so we traveled for, that's very, very interesting. In my book, Eva's Story, my mother and me write together what happened when we were traveling with the Russians.
Well, we'll take a break here in the interview, Eva, and in the second part of the interview, if people want to tune into the next part, we'll be talking with Eva about post World War II and her life, in Russia, and Otto Frank, the diaries, and of course Heinz's paintings. So, Shindera Leshan Clara, so Eva, in the last part, we were talking about your life in the death camps, your post-Holocaust, during, and your life in the camps. And we're now on to the part where you were liberated and your life post World War II, and how you had met Otto, and the relationship between Otto and your mother and your brother's beautiful artwork. So,
right, yeah. So the Russian decided it's not safe for us to stay there, so they organized transport. So it was again the same kind of cattle trucks, because that was, the army even lived the same way when they were traveling, but they were in the middle was because it was winter, it was very, very cold. They put a stove in the middle, and if we were not traveling, the doors were open, so we could jump down and walk around and see who else is on the transport beat, because from other camps, other people came as well. So it was huge, huge transport of people. Even prisoners of war were there. And so we traveled. They fed us twice, 3 times a day. They gave us drinks and food. And but of course, we still slept on the floor. And there were men and women together. So there were buckets for toilets which could be emptied, but it stopped several times. And you usually went on the toilet next to the train station. It wasn't a station, just when it stopped, when other troop transports were going the different direction. It was very busy, the lines, because the Russians were sending tanks and all kind of war material for the soldiers and food for the soldiers. So sometimes we were standing for many days on a line, and also trains went different direction. It was, it was wartime,
yeah.
But we saw through Russia unbelievable devastations. The Germans had burned down every town, every village, every field. It was terrible. When the train stopped, people came from under the ground where they made kind of caves where they were living. And they all came with lists, Jewish people, non-Jewish people. If you had met this one, if you was very often, they had photos to show, did you see this, perhaps this person, and so on. The army had a lot of Jewish soldiers as well, and they wanted to know if we had perhaps come across their families. Of course, we never could comfort anybody that we had seen people like that. And but the Russians were all very, very young soldiers, and when we stopped, and with us there were, my mother was, she was early 40s, but there were as well a few younger people, and they were, of course, there was no rape or anything like this going on. They were very respectful, but still they had a bit of flirts. And then one day we had to stay overnight with the army, and they said, we need people to peel potatoes, who is helping? And my mother and me right away volunteered. And then they gave us some vodka afterwards. And when it was finished, they said, and now we are going to dance. So the Russian, they had the balalaika and things, all kind of instruments, and this, and you know, I was young, I was 15, and I enjoyed that, and they taught me Russian dances, you know, to on my knees and all that. I was very good. I could do all this, and yeah, we had actually quite a good fun with them. And one day,
You yourself, though you won't admit it, I would imagine, carried the same artistic and creative gene that Heinz did, because you went on to study art,
that's right,
and
yeah,
and and that was so. When you go back to when you were talking about how Anne Frank was more studious and more worldly, if you like, than you, and Heinz was into books and you weren't, you were into sport, but you had the creative spirit. You were interested, like Anne, in her writing. You were interested in art. So
correct.
was
But
that
they
fostered?
developed all much, much later. At
Yeah,
that time, I was still, you know, I've missed 3 years of education, and that is in so the Heidegger and the Auschwitz, but as well in Belgium, so the language, and then in Holland, so the language. I had I was obviously not talented in languages, so that was all for me very, very difficult. But my brother, he told himself in Heidegger 4 languages. You know,
yeah.
he was studious. He was quite a different type from me. But I caught up later, much, much later.
I'm a bit like that. I'm a bit like that, Eva. Everything came to me later in life. All
Yeah,
I was interested in was creativity when I was a child, and academia came later in life. There's a time for everyone to get their act
exactly,
together.
exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So,
Yeah, I mean, if I wouldn't have had the brother who did everything for me, what I should do, you know, learning, I would have done it. But it was much easier just for him to tell me everything. So it was, yeah, we had a
so
wonderful relationship.
you were a creative person. I mean, my primary degree is in art as well,
Yeah,
like yours. So
yeah,
I understand a person like you whose head is not in books, but in other things
yeah.
growing. But what was it like growing up in, or if you like, going through your teens in Russia at the time? It must have felt, your life must have felt in some respects a whirlwind, because you were born in Austria, you had lived in France, you had lived in the Netherlands, you were now in Germany, or you were in Germany, then you were in Russia.
Yeah. So,
You,
you know, all different countries, different ways. But I really enjoyed this trip back with the Russians. You know, they were really. So one day he came, a few soldiers came and they said, "We've got a surprise for you." And they put out big tables and they put on a heap of brass, and they said, because we had, of course, nothing, you know. So they said, but come, and and so we just uh, showed our breast, and with their hands they went like this, measured, oh, this is this size, and they gave us, but it was not, you know, sexy or anything. It was just fun. They laughed and we laughed. We had really fun with them. We were very proud of the Russian bra which we got. And then later we got Russian uniforms because what we had was worn out. So a skirt and a blouse with all the buttons. So I've still got that, but of course
you sent me
it
the
was
photo.
a very small size, doesn't fit me anymore, you know. But yeah, yeah, I was it. I was very pleased with that. And yeah, so you know, I have a soft heart for the Russians because I definitely owe my life to them. If they wouldn't have come then and there, I wouldn't be around. I know that.
You
Much, much
and I know,
later, I
and
went back to Russia because they said um, I will meet some of the soldiers who had liberated the camp. And that was, of course, very interesting for me as well. So And I've been actually a few times to Russia, give talks there as well. And of course,
You
they had
obviously, you obviously,
suffered the most of the war. There's
you
no
obviously
way to, you know, the battle of Stalingrad and the what is it called? Where they had the siege, um, Leningrad,
see,
Stalingrad was unbelievable. You know, they died. Millions of people died from starvation.
yeah.
But they didn't give up. Hitler had a hotel there earmarked where he was going to celebrate the victory. He never got there, of course. The Russians were really, and they lost 30, 40 million of their people.
They did. It was a
Yeah,
slaughter,
yeah,
slaughter. But
yeah.
you know, at what I know you came later on to England and you met your husband Zwei Schloss, whose father was also a, a prisoner at Dachau
Correct.
concentration camp.
Yeah.
So, did you feel in some respects that sense of, now I know that many survivors, if you were to look at the book by Art Spiegelman, and he talks about his mother and his father, and when his mother committed suicide and his father remarried, they never got on. His parents never got, or his stepmother and his father never got on because they had so much in common. It was almost a barrier. It was almost a constant reminder of what they had suffered. Was it helpful to you to have been with somebody who understood in some way the level of trauma that you had experienced, or was that, were you constantly reminders? Do you know, is it a double-edged sword when both a husband
Well,
and wife have
with my
been?
mother, of course, you know, she went through the same, and she lost her son and her husband, and I lost my father and my brother. So we had a lot in common. So we were always very, very, very close.
Yeah,
And but about Otto, that comes a little bit later. Otto was on the same transport, of course, with
yeah,
us, but he kept very much to himself. But there was a woman on the transport who he met on that when we were, you know, when it was stopping and we could walk around, who knew that his wife had died. So he learned that on this transport. Um, but nobody really had seen the girls, so nobody knew about them. So he had really great hopes that they were still alive. Yeah. And
at what
so
age did Otto find out that Anne and Margot had died? Because I don't think he never actually physically saw them ever again.
um, no, no, no. But he assumed that they would be alive because they were young and strong, you know, and they were obviously not in Auschwitz, so he had no idea. But he had, yeah, but he had really great hope, especially seeing me same age who had survived. So why not his girls? But anyway, we come to that later. Uh, so we traveled from beginning of February till May in those trains. Sometimes we stopped. This one stopped in Romania, and we stopped. We were going to the town, and so it was. But of course, we were all very anxious to get back home and find out what had happened to the family. So in May, we were in Odessa on the Black Sea.
Yeah.
Beautiful weather. There was this lovely beach. They put us in an old, it was occupied by the Nazis, and the whole city was quite ruined. But there was an old building which was very solid. I think it was a little palace, completely empty inside, but they put us there. And so they warned us not to go into town because we won't find back. But my mother and me, by that time, we had recovered our strengths. And my mother said, well, we'll never ever come back to Odessa, but let's explore the city. And so we went outside because it was a bit of a suburb, near the sea. And
Yeah.
we saw a tram, so we went on the tram and we saw the big city and we had a good time. And then when we wanted to get back, we had no idea how to get back because the numbers of the bus was in a Russian letter, so we had no idea. So it took us many hours till we found our way back. And that was very scary. And when we go back, we got very much told off. They said, we told you you are not allowed to go outside, you can go on the beach, but not into town. So that was a lesson I'd learned with the Russian, not to go against their rules. Yeah, and then there was a lot of Australian prisoners of war who were waiting there to be shipped at home. And what was very, very painful, the prisoners of war got packets from the Red Cross, but the survivors from the camps didn't get it. So, but the Australians shared with us chocolate, cigarettes if you smoked, and they gave us toothbrushes and toothpaste and soap and things like that, So we were there quite for few weeks, but we started to worry, how are we ever going to get back to the West? We had no money, and nobody really told us what was going on. But then eventually a New Zealand troop transport ship came, the Monoway it was called, and they were going to take us back to the West. So we had to register. So we were French, Italian, Austrian, German, all kind of nationality. We had to register where we want to go back and so on. And this was then the journey back home on the Mediterranean. That was, of course, beautiful. And the ship was equipped with sort of, for us, luxury. We ate on tables with tablecloths. We had proper cutlery. We had nothing. We always ate with plastic or with our hands. But the food was very good. But we took always, if there was bread over, we took it back into the cabin. And one day the captain made an announcement, please don't take food down to the cabin because we will get mice there. And there's always enough. If you want more, just come and ask in the kitchen, but don't take it in the cabin.
Yeah.
But, that was a habit with us.
It's amazing. I've spoken to many Holocaust survivors, and a friend of mine, her father was a survivor of 5 camps, including Auschwitz. And he said, to the day he died, she said she was always finding bread in his pockets. And he had Alzheimer's for the last 15 years of his life. But he'd always still stuff the bread into his pocket. And she'd say, Dad, why are you holding bread in your pocket? People will think we're not feeding you. Everywhere he went, there was a roll stuffed in.
I know. That is a habit which stays for a long time with you. Yeah, to be afraid to starve again. Yeah. Well, that is definitely well. And then we stopped in Istanbul, to take on some water or provision or whatever. And we wanted to go. Everybody really wanted to go on land, but they didn't let us. They said you might have typhus or illnesses or lice. They didn't trust us at all yet, so we couldn't go. But we could write letters. They said, if you write a letter, we'll get some posted. So we wrote to my grandmother and grandfather, who was saved in England, said, my mother and me are all right, but we don't know yet about Heinz and my father, but we hope they'll be safe. And Otto wrote to his family, we are traveling back now to Holland on a boat, and as soon as I get back to Amsterdam, I come and visit you. But he wrote we, and the family thought they were all survived. But of course, they were very, very disappointed when they heard it wasn't so. But Otto meant we the group, he didn't realize what it was. Yeah, yeah. And then we went to Genoa, where they were Italians, they could get off, but we wanted to get off too. And because we thought we could travel then back to Holland from Genoa, but they didn't want us. They said, oh, you might have typhus or illnesses or lice. We were really not human beings really related from camps. They still thought, we were not acceptable in an ordinary life, which was actually, we were very upset about that. But then we got to Marseille, and there we could get down. And there was a band to welcome us, but it turned out later it was really for the prisoners, the French prisoners, because there were quite a few as well. And then a long journey back to the Netherlands. And in Belgium, we had to stop. We were put into a monastery because, the Dutch have all rivers going from inland to the sea, and we would have had to cross it, but the bridges were not repaired.
Yeah.
So we couldn't go that. So we waited there again, very anxious to get back eventually. And then eventually, when it was done, we were traveling by bus to Amsterdam. And there we were dropped at the station, and that was it. We had no money, we didn't know where to go. We were in shock, we had never, for years, we had not looked after ourselves, and suddenly we were independent, and here you are, you get on with it. And in Holland, it was terrible because Holland was the only country which was occupied till the end of the war.
Yeah.
All the other countries were already in 44 and later, but Holland was occupied, and the Germans took everything the Dutch produced to take to Germany to feed their own people, which is perhaps understandable. But in Holland, there were no cats and dogs had all been eaten. Can you imagine? There was literally no food. People went to the farmers. They came back with one potato to feed a family of 4. People opened apartments when a stench came out, and there were 5 bodies lying there. So it was terrible.
A colleague of ours here in the station is from Holland. Dirk de Klein is his name, and he's like me. He's dedicated to remembering the Holocaust, and some of his people were resistance fighters against Nazism. But he writes a very good blog about the Holocaust and remembering the victims as well. But so he's from the Netherlands, but it just beggars belief what the human being will do to survive, and the thoughts of eating anything that would be your pet.
I know. Terrible. So of course they were not pleased that more and more people came. Then as well by train came from Germany, people who had been in the camps there and been freed, and nobody really cared for them. There were no organizations yet to do anything like that. That took many years to organize that. They were registered, and the Americans registered people, but what to do with those people? And a lot of people were still very weak and ill. So we didn't really know what to do, where to go. So we had a friendly couple who was good friends with my father, called Rosenbaum. He was a lawyer, she Jewish, but it was a mixed marriage. She was a Christian Austrian. So we
Yes.
hoped some mixed marriages were saved, others were arrested as well. But so we hope perhaps they would still be there.
Yeah.
And so my mother said, well, let's go to the Rosenbaums and see if we can stay there perhaps a bit and find out what to do then. So we went there, and Mr. Rosenbaum opened the door to us, and oh, come in, very pleased to see. Where is Eric and Heinz? So, well, we don't know yet, And then he said, where is your wife? He said, oh, she's in hospital. We just got a little baby boy. And this is very interesting. They were a middle-aged couple, and they were always very, well, I wouldn't say jealous, but very, oh, they said, Eric, my father, you are so lucky. You have two lovely kids. And we tried to get children, but nothing happens. And they were both very, very heavy smokers, chain smokers. But in the war, they couldn't smoke. And suddenly she conceived and she was pregnant with a baby.
Wow.
So, I thought always, smoking is so bad. Anyway, so he said, well, come and stay with me where my wife is in hospital. And my mother, he said, you can cook for me and do the household. But there was no electricity, no gas. There was a petrol stove. It smelled very badly, but cooked a bit there. So it was all very, very primitive still at the time. But so we stayed a few days there, and then the wife came home from hospital, and there was a lovely little baby, and I was in love with him because, that was new life and, very, very sweet. And so I looked after him a bit and so on. But then they said, well, we haven't really got room, So my mother said, well, let's see perhaps our apartment, because it was rented. It wasn't ours really. And the furniture was all there. Perhaps it is still available to us. And it was, because there were so many empty apartments. And so she didn't let it, and we could go back there, which was, of course, a great, great help for us.
There's
And
a sense
it
of
was
normality.
sad. I saw on the wall where my father had measured us, how we had grown. I saw all the signs, and I saw everything what we have used, and so. But we had hope. Well, perhaps they come back. And every day people came back from Germany, from the border, and we put adverts in the paper. Otto Frank came to visit us. He stayed with Miep Gies, who was one of the helpers, who had only a very small apartment, and he wasn't very, he thought, they're not married so long, they have a nice life before. He didn't want to stay there so much. So he went out visiting all the people to find out if anybody knew where his girls were. And eventually he heard from two women who were in Bergen-Belsen when the girls died. So he knew. So of course he was shattered. But only then did Miep give him the diary, because she wanted to give it really back to Anne. But she waited
You
till
found
Otto
the
was
diary.
telling the
Me,
diary, the
me
famous
found.
diary, Anne's diary, because she had saved it. Otto didn't know, of course. But this is as well very interesting. When the Nazis arrested the family, Miep was Austrian. Did you know that?
I read that she was Austrian, and I saw her being introduced at the Oscars. Gillian Walns Perry was telling me about how she was introduced at the Oscars when the documentary on Anne Frank's diary won the Oscar. And she's a tiny little lady. I think she's only my height, 4'10". And to have had such an impact in history, she found the diary on the floor and then she gave it to Otto.
Yeah,
which
yeah,
went
yeah,
right.
yeah, yeah. But that is interesting as well, which isn't so much known, but I just tell you. So she was Austrian during the First World War, and Austria lost that, of course, as
Yeah,
well. And
yeah,
there was very, very little food. I know that as well from my parents. I said, after the war, it was terrible. And the Dutch offered to take Dutch children for a year to feed them up because Holland was not in the war in the First World War, so they
yeah.
were not enemies. So they did that. And Miep was one of those children who went to Holland for a year to be fed,
Right.
and she liked it so much there. And this is something I don't quite understand. So she wanted to stay there, and her parents gave her up. She said, yeah, you can stay with this Dutch family, which is funny, but I don't know. That is what
Did
happened.
strange things in those days. I mean, people were reared
Yeah, yeah.
times by
Well, it
grandparents.
was bad. They didn't have enough money. They thought if she's well looked after, perhaps it's a better thing. And so when Otto came in 33, he was looking for a secretary. And Miep, she was then in the early 20s, she tried to get the job. And because Otto couldn't speak Dutch yet, but Miep spoke German and Dutch, he engaged her. So very, otherwise he might have taken somebody else and the diary might have been lost. So through this, and then she became very, very friendly with the family, looked after the children sometimes and so on. And so they became really very, very close.
And for people who don't know, Miep Kies was the person who hid Anna Frank and Otto uh, um, and the family. And it was then afterwards, as we said, that she found the diary in the
Well,
attic.
there were four people two men and two women who looked after the Franks while they were in hiding because there were 8 people.
Eight
So,
people.
one couldn't have done that. But Miep was the one who was a personal friend and
Yeah,
very close. And especially with Anne, she had a very good relationship and so on.
yeah,
So, yeah. The others were the 2 men which were, well, very friendly with Otto, but not in the same way as me.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And did Peter survive, the little boy that Anna had a crush on in the
No,
in?
Otto was the only survivors of the eight people, and he was by far the oldest. So that's amazing too, really, huh?
She's it's just like, I mean, I look at the situation with COVID now, and I think now more than ever, children should be learning the Diary of Anne Frank, because children who've had to be in lockdown for so long and having
Yeah,
to cope with isolation
yeah,
learn so much from, say, you and from Anne, who were in similar situations at 14, 13, 12 years of age, hidden away and having to occupy yourselves and keep your hopes up. Because hope is really the greatest thing that you can have.
exactly, exactly. Yeah, I saw this morning on television that so many mainly young girls, not boys so much, but some boys as well, that they harm themselves and they are depressed and have breakdowns because of the COVID. And I said
Anorexia is on the rise because
that
of
they
COVID.
don't, they are not eating, not eating. Um, and I say, this is, of course, it's terrible that you can't go and meet your friends, but, it's uncomparable to what we had to go through. And we had to struggle for our lives, and it was man-made. This is nature has done this, So,
Well,
well,
no.
the virus is it's not something.
At least now nobody was afraid that when they go outside the door that they're going to be taken and never see their parents again, that they're going to be kidnapped or taken and murdered. it's an invisible enemy that we have right now. When you were in hiding, you were afraid to go outside the door because people would find out you were a Jew and take you from your parents and potentially kill you. But at what stage did you and your family, your mother and you meet up again, say with Otto, to the point that a relationship developed between your mother and Otto that
Yes,
brought
well,
your family even closer?
well, Otto was lonely. My mother was lonely. My mother had to earn a living. Otto came to help, give her advice. And yeah, so they became, my mother asked him to stay for supper. And, so we had family. And me too. I was very, very, very depressed. I was more depressed afterwards when I heard that my father and brother, yeah, I haven't told you, we got a letter from the Red Cross that both my father and brother perished in Mauthausen, this terrible camp, several days before the American army came to liberate that camp. That was something I just could not accept,
Yeah, no.
So, yeah, so I got really depressed and I started to hate not only the Germans, of course, most, but everybody, because I knew that it could have been avoided. So I was very bitter. And in 1st of January 1946, I wrote a note to myself that life without my father and brother has no meaning for me. I would really like to commit suicide. I never did it, of course, but I felt so low. I didn't really want to live.
Yeah, well, that's
And
understandable.
But and Otto, who lost everything, he said, came off when they said, the only thing I have is the clothes I have on my body. I have nothing else. And he didn't hate. I said, but how can you not hate the people who killed your whole family? And he said, look, it's the Germans did it, but I am German. We lived there since 1500. My family has been always Germans. And I love the literature. I love the music. I love the language. He was an officer in the First World War. I said, how can I hate my own people? He said, yes, those Nazis were terrible, but it doesn't mean that all the Germans are evil and bad, And he said, if you hate the people you hate, they don't suffer, but you will suffer. You become a miserable woman. And that was true. I was very, very miserable. I didn't want to go back to school. I turned 16. I said, I can't face going with those youngsters. I felt I was an adult, And but Otto told my mother, you have to see that she gets a good education. That's the only thing nobody can take away from her. So I went to a very good school where my brother had been, and the head teacher had special classes for people who had lost a few years of learning. And I did actually very well. I became quite intellectual, changing. And
I know
I
the
was
feeling.
very good in science, maths, and all the science. And I could speak, of course, French and German. So that helped as well. And
And Russian.
no, Russian, a few words, but not really speak it. But I became a very good pupil. I was one of the better ones because I didn't want, when they had parties, they were 15, 16, 17, even 18. It was very jolly after that, after a few years, and I never went to anything. And I got a job as a photographer while I was still in school. After school, I went by bicycle to the studio to learn photography. And that was an art photography. We took art buildings in Amsterdam and all, you know, cultural things, and people use this for lectures. We made slides for lectures. And then I met a professor and he said, well, when you are finished with school, why don't you come to my class and do to study art? And I agreed with that. But once I did that, I had not the rest to leave, to sit and listen to lectures. I was restless. And so
how obsessed was Otto about getting the diary, Anne's diary? What was the effect on him?
Published.
And then how obsessed was he? Did he feel that it was the burning obsession that he get it published, or was he reluctant to publish it? He
was very, very proud of the wisdom which Anne showed in the book. But he said she had a very bad relationship with her mother.
Yeah.
And she was dead. So Otto didn't really want to share this with the world.
Yeah.
And as well with the other people. She was not an easy girl, you know. She had a will of her own, and she, you know, and so she criticized a lot of people and so on. So the diary was, he wasn't sure if she would have wanted this published, and he didn't want to tell that Anne made her mother suffer so much. She was crying a lot because Anne didn't want her, you know. So it was, but people said it's such a valuable document, you have to publish it.
But the thing about it with Anna was that, and it's an example, I suppose, for children and everyone today as well with the lockdown again, is that Anna was cooped up, if you like, for 2 years in a small confined space with people whom she was genetically connected to, her mother and Margot and Peter, because they all shared the same ethnicity. But she never felt that she had anything in common with any of them, because she was afraid to talk, because she said people would misunderstand her. Whereas when she put things down in her diary, she said only Kitty understood what she really was thinking. Nobody else could understand her. It was almost like Kitty became the friend. And in the end, and I said it in my book, in the end, I suppose Kitty became her betrayer, because when the book was published, all her very thoughts that she thought were only between her and Kitty suddenly became the world's. I'm wondering how difficult it was for Otto to make that decision and I can understand how he felt that he didn't want the fraught relationship between Anna and her mother to be made public.
Yeah, well, he edited it. He didn't add anything, but he took a few things out. So, but later, after he died, he left the diary to the Dutch government, because that's the safest place. He didn't want to give it to anybody. So, and they decided they would publish what Anne wrote. So it's so there are actually quite a few different publications with comparing this with Otto published and which Anne wrote and things like that. So there's a lot of studies, a lot of people who have really gone into it, studying the diary to compare what she wrote. And then as well, while they were listening to the radio, was it the Dutch minister said, you should write your memories so that after the war people can read how it was, you know. So she started to recopy the diary and wrote a bit different for publication. So there was a lot of different things, and so Otto had a bit of a struggle to find what to publish. But it was actually in Holland not a big success, because people all had suffered so much, like I told you, and they wanted to move on, get on with life and not read about terrible things in the. I was still miserable in Holland. And so Otto found me, well, Otto and my mother decided I should become a photographer, which was okay with me. And so he found me a job in London at the studio. And so I came to London and he gave me his Leica because he took lots of pictures of his children, but he said, I have no family anymore. I'm not going to take any more pictures. So this is a very, very good camera. So I hope you become a good photographer.
He loved photography, didn't he?
Say again?
He loved photography.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I went to a studio to learn in the darkroom, the commercial, you know, for adverts and things like that. And I learned it like this, and I enjoyed it because I was very handy. And color photography came just in, and I did a course at Kodak to learn how to print that. Very complicated, but I was excellent with all this. And I lived in a boarding house in Cricklewood, and there was a young man who had come from Israel to study economics, and we became good friends. You know, we both didn't have any money. I earned £3, he earned £3, and he was studying at the School of Economics and had a job. So we went for long walks, but we didn't tell each other who we were really. I said I was Dutch, which I wasn't, and he said he was Israeli. He was actually a German refugee to Palestine. And so, but we liked each other. And after 6 months, he said to me, Eva, I've fallen in love with you. Will you marry me? And I said, no, thank you. Because can you imagine, I was very, very close to my mother. I couldn't imagine that I would just desert her and go live with somebody, you know, get married. So Otto came over.
I can understand that.
Looked after me, he kept an eye on me. And because, you know, he considered me already then a replacement for his daughter, same age, friend of her. So he was very nice with me, and I loved him too. And so I told him this young man has asked me to marry him, but of course I will go back to Amsterdam. So he said, your mother and me have fallen in love as well. And once you get married, we like to get married as well. So I went back to this young man and I said, you can marry me now? So we did that. We went the next year in 1952. We went to Amsterdam and we got married there.
Died in 2016.
Yeah, and Otto and my mother got married a year later in 1953. And they moved to Switzerland because they wanted to start a new life. That is where Otto's sister, and at the time his mother, was still alive. So they moved there, and my husband wanted to go to Israel, but I didn't want to. I said, I've been already in so many countries, I can't cope with another language and another country. So we decided we would stay in London.
You stayed in rainy London as a whole.
And we were married for 63 years. But I always say, you know, it was a gamble because we didn't really know each other. Both of us had not talked about who we really were. He was a German refugee whose father was in the camp, he lost his father. He was 15. He had to go already to work to look after his mother, but he studied by himself, and he became very, very good and clever and educated. And we had 3 daughters, and we stayed in England. Yeah, well, of course, I did go and pick up the paintings. 30 paintings, amazing, amazing artwork, really, really beautiful, different subjects, but all painted from just imagination. You know, he never saw anything. He was cooped up and did this. Um, uh, if you look it up on the internet, you will find lots and lots of his paintings. And many, many years ago, I donated it to the Resistance Museum in Amsterdam so that many people can see it. And, you know, I said, my mother, Anne, she lives on, wherever you go, everybody knows who Anne is. But Heinz, who was as well such a talent, a musician, a painter, he wrote as well many beautiful poems, and all in hiding, and nobody knows about his existence. And he died when he was not quite 18 years old. So my task was to write a book about him. That is my second book, called The Promise, that he will not be forgotten. And so the paintings I donated to the Resistance Museum so that many people can see it. We have several exhibitions in South Africa. They made an exhibition about his life and his work. And we have an exhibition as well here, but it's, of course, at the moment it's stored away. And in America, I have displayed the paintings. And now I'm working actually with an American friend on an animation film about Heinz.
Oh my God, that sounds absolutely fabulous. That sounds absolutely wonderful. Did you ever think of setting up a foundation? Like I know you got very involved with Gillian Wallens Perry, and the two of you both received MBEs from the Queen. And I'm not sure if I should curtsy to you, like I said to Gillian, if I should curtsy to the two of you. But you received it for your work with the Anne Frank Foundation in London. Did you ever think of setting up a Heinz Geiringer Foundation?
No, I haven't got a foundation, but we formed, of course, the Anne Frank Trust at the time. I was one of the first who was involved with it, and yeah, and you know, of course, normally I wouldn't even be here. I would be in America. I spend usually 6 months traveling America. I've been in China. I've been in Japan. I've been in Australia, always talking about my experience and about Heinz, of course.
And I mean, I've seen his artwork. It's absolutely wonderful, his artwork. Yeah, and the idea that, again, it was hidden underneath the floorboards in the attic that he was hiding in.
Yeah, and he never saw what he painted, all imagination, but so true to life.
Well, Eva, I'm conscious that I've kept you a long time, and I'm conscious that your lighting in your apartment is shocking. I have no idea what the power keeps going on you there. All I can do is thank you very, very much for giving me your time today.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Are you from Dublin?
Limerick. It's in the southwest.
I've been to Dublin quite a few times. I spoke in Ireland, north and south, and yeah, it's a lovely country. I've got a very good friend. He always invites me to come. He lives near the seaside, but I haven't had the chance to do that yet. But perhaps I will do it still once.
Well, hopefully when lockdown ends. I was born in London, and my father was in London, and I understand to an extent the difficulties with separation, because I was 14,
Yeah.
15 before my dad came home to Ireland to live. He couldn't get a job there. So I only saw my dad once a year, and he lived in England and we lived here. So once COVID ends, hopefully you and I can meet up.
Yes, that would be nice. That would be nice.
Would be.
Yeah.
So anyway, Shindera leis an chlár. That's the end of the show for today. Until the next time, Lacúnamh Day, Bawallam Tugalir, Chiacana, Sonas Agus Gro, Agus Gadeshif Sloan. Thank you, Eva, and Shalom.
Shalom. Yes, you're welcome. You're welcome. I hope the world gets back to a more peaceful solution for everybody.
Well, we can only hope. We can certainly only hope that it doesn't go back in the direction that led you to suffer the way you did.
Yes, exactly. Let's hope so, huh? Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Yeah. Bye-bye, Mary.